cómo tu arquitectura y tu infraestructura pueden mejorar o empeorar la productividad de tu equipo. Este es el título de la charla que Jason Lengstorff va a dar en la próxima GS Nation que se celebra del 9 al 11 de junio. Y hoy, antes de eso, te traigo una pequeña entrevista con Jason para que lo conozcas, porque lo tienes que conocer, porque crea un montón de contenido súper interesante. Tiene un canal de YouTube y también Twitch que hace Learn with Jason, que aparte de ser divertidísimo, pues trae invitados especiales para que te enseñen diferentes cosas de desarrollo web. Y Jason tiene un montón de experiencia, ha trabajado en IBM, en Gatsby y actualmente es VP de la Developer Experience en Netlify. Pues vamos a hablar un poco con Jason, a ver qué nos cuenta. Thank you for coming and sharing a little of your time with the Spanish-speaking community. Jason, how are you doing?
Of course. I'm super happy to be here. I don't speak enough Spanish to be useful, but hola, gracias.
Oh, well, that's enough. I think that you have the same level of Spanish that my English, I would say.
That's very modest of you. I can only talk about food. I have greetings and food. That's all I know.
Well, food is useful enough, if you ask me. So, Jason, you are here because you are going to talk on the GS Nation conference, and you are going to talk about how your architecture and infrastructure can make or break your team's productivity. And I would like to know more. Could you share more details about this talk?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that when we talk about the way that teams work, a lot of times we think about processes. We think about whether we should be agile or whether we should use waterfall or how many people are involved and things like that. But sometimes we don't stop to consider the effect that the tools, technology, and platforms that we choose really impact the productivity that we have. So this talk is kind of diving into the ways that our infrastructure affect our productivity and how that can turn into really engaged, productive teams, or kind of start the downward spiral into disengaged, slow teams that are frustrated all the time.
I'm pretty sure about this. It's like your talk is gonna be something that you hard learn in some way.
Yeah.
I guess, because all of us sometimes we had this problem of productivity or ground decisions in our infra. So could you share some hard lessons, learn lessons about the ground front architecture or infra that impacted your team's productivity?
Yeah. So back in the day, I worked at IBM, and I was helping with the front end architecture there. And one of the projects that we ran into, we were dealing with a monolith turned microservices. And what we had found was that each microservice had kind of become a mini monolith. So we'd split apart all of these areas of concern, but the front ends were still very coupled to the back ends. And that meant that for me as a front end developer to deploy our front end, we had to deal with a node server. We had to deal with a reverse proxy. We were configuring Nginx. I was getting into Docker. I was dealing with Kubernetes config, all of these things just so that we could take front end changes live. And this was challenging for me. And I do have some back-end experience. Back in the day, I used to do a lot of PHP dev, and I worked in the, in that kind of full server stack of web development. For our team members who weren't experienced with the back end at all, it was a complete just bungee jump into areas they had no understanding of, and that's not a really productive place to put somebody. If you're looking at setting somebody up to succeed, giving them a bunch of tasks that aren't the thing they were hired to do so that they can do the thing they were hired to do, that just sets them up for failure, right? And so we were seeing really, really slow turnaround, not because the team wasn't capable, but because we were asking a group of professionals to do a completely different job. It was like hiring a plumber to come in and do carpentry. It just didn't make sense. Like, a professional spends a lot of time learning a craft. If you bring them in and ask them to do a different thing, it sets them up to, like, they'll be able to figure it out. We're all professionals. We're all very smart, but it put us in this position where we were just spending a lot of time trying to figure out things that weren't really in our job description. And that was when I really started to understand the benefits of organizing architecture to make teams productive, as opposed to, just kind of fitting into whatever had always existed. Let's think about how we can optimize that. How can we make teams more effective? And that led me to today.
it sounds like my history, you know. It's like I feel like a lot of us lately, in the I don't know the last few years, we face the same problems with like trying to move a monolithic application to some or trying to only move to React maybe from a monolithic app in terms of talking about front end, to try to use React and then do a Node.js server with a proxy, reverse proxy, in order to be able to migrate every path to the new system. It's
Right.
it's like the same, and we face the same problems. A lot of people in this
Yeah.
case. So, do you have some kind of strategy or some kind of tip in order to try to avoid this problem that then you face like, wow, I have to move this huge architecture from a monolithic app, and I have to try to do a modern front-end architecture, or maybe a front-end or app architecture. That's all.
Yeah. So I go into a little more details in the talk
Yeah.
that I'll be giving at JS Nation, but the short version is we should be aiming to decouple things at the right levels of abstraction. So
Yeah.
the biggest thing that happens is things get complex. And as systems get complex, it becomes harder and harder for somebody to reason about the whole system. So if we look at where that complexity comes in, we can usually identify where it's necessary. The app does more. We need to take care of more user interactions or more pieces of data, and where it's unnecessary, where for whatever reason we've completely coupled the deployment of our front end to the deployment of our back end. And if we start to create separations and boundaries to eliminate the unnecessary complexity, then we're able to unchain teams to be able to work in their areas of expertise and move much more quickly.
Sometimes when we are building a product, it's like we are always adding stuff, you know, we are like piling up more features and more features. And then usually we don't stop and think about what we should remove in order to remove complexity. And I think it's something very interesting, and we have to try to remember, you know, when we are building a product, what would be quick for you or fast enough for you, a new deployment, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
So there's definitely kind of a scale of this, right? So when I joined IBM, or when I consult for other large companies, their deployment processes are weeks. They deploy once a week on Thursday, and to get into that deployment queue, you've got to, you know, get your PR merged, and then it'll spend a week or two across staging and dev and QA branches before it finally gets merged into the branch that will go live on Thursday. So it's 3 weeks between merging your PR and when it actually goes live. That's very, very slow. So to me, being able to get something live within a day is amazing. I think there's no better feeling than being able to deploy something within, you know, a few minutes of merging your PR. And really what we're looking for is a model where you're at truly continuous deployment. You merge a PR and it goes live. But I mean, aspirationally, I think you should be able to deploy in a minute. Like, you know, my website, Learn with Jason, for example, it builds on takes about a minute to get a site live, and, you know, minute 10 seconds or so, and that's from the minute, like when I click the button to merge a PR, or when I publish something in my CMS, a minute later it's been built and republished, and that's to production. So I think that there's a world where we get that kind of instant CI/CD setup. And I don't think it's out of reach, because even like the Netlify team, we publish app.netlify.com, which is built in this way. It's published to production 5, 6, 10 times a day, including Fridays. Like, you know, we're able to just continuously push to production because of this setup.
One thing that you mentioned that I think it's so important, and I would like to ask you about, is like a lot of people think that doing deployments on Friday, it's like a bad idea, or it's like or you shouldn't do it. I am against that idea, but I would like to ask you, because you mentioned that you deploy on Fridays. So what do you think about it? What do you think about people thinking that Fridays is a bad day to deploy?
Well, I think the decision to not deploy on Fridays isn't necessarily because people believe that you should or shouldn't. It's risk mitigation, right? You don't want to have to work on the weekend. And so if you have a risky deployment where things frequently break, things are fragile, you've got flakiness. Deploying on Friday is it's kind of rolling the dice. Maybe I'm going to get paged and have to spend my Saturday working. But if you have an infrastructure and you've got a setup that's not flaky, where you've got disaster recovery, like a good example is if you follow the infrastructure that I like, which is the Jamstack, rollbacks are one click. If something goes wrong and I get paged on Saturday, I just open up the dashboard, click no, let's roll that back, and I go back about my business, right? And even with that, usually you don't need to, because you're not deploying like big risky systems. You're deploying compiled assets, and if they look right in the deploy preview, they're going to look right in production. So you're eliminating that risk, which makes you more confident to say, yeah, we can deploy on Friday because we don't get paged. We've built a stable enough system and a stable enough deployment process that when things go live, we don't have that fear that maybe something unexpected will go wrong and we're all going to get called in to fix it.
Yeah, totally. I think that the same, no? It's like the feeling of my app is not reliable, so I'm not gonna deploy it on Friday because I don't want to work on weekends. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, right. Like I don't like to go after people for the end result, right? Like not deploying on Fridays is a symptom, not the root cause.
Exactly. So how do you describe a good-looking front-end architecture?
I mean, the best front-end architecture is the one that you can understand, right? And I think that the whole goal is to just eliminate that unnecessary complexity. I'm personally a big fan of following the Jamstack architecture because you're decoupling your front end completely. You're pre-compiling as many things as possible, which means there's fewer moving parts. There are fewer things that can go down, and your deployment is just a CDN, which a CDN is very reliable in terms of things that are going to go down. A CDN is probably pretty low on the list of possible failures, and that to me gives a huge amount of confidence to my team, and it also puts up the right constraints where we don't accidentally creep in complexity, where we just reach for that one little server-side thing that changes our front-end app from a front-end app to a full-stack app that we have to maintain. So it keeps us inside of our constraints and make sure that we're thinking about APIs and how we communicate across boundaries, instead of doing little one-offs that become leaky and start to build up into a lot of complexity.
For wrapping up, something that I like a lot of your work is like you not only teach a lot about code, that it's very good, and not only you entertain because your content is very funny sometimes, it's that you care a lot about life balance. I check your website and you have like an ebook, and you are like that you could be successful in your life without sacrificing like your personal life. And I would like if you could like share some tips, or maybe for balancing the work life and efficiency for the viewers of the MeDoDev channel.
I think the thing that's important to me is to remember that the reason that we have a job, the reason that we work, is to make a living. And I think that a lot of times we can invert that and start to think that we live to work, right? Because we spend a lot of time working. We spend a lot of time trying to get ahead in our careers. But we can start to think about our life as the thing that happens after we work. Like, well, I'm going to work really hard now and give up a bunch of stuff between now and whenever, and then I'll finally be done with working and I'll be able to live. So I think that instead we should think about, how do we really live our lives now? How do we structure our work so that we do enough work to advance, but not so much that we don't get to live? That's not a very actionable kind of guideline, but it's a heuristic that I use. Is like, am I making sacrifices where I'm skipping things that I'm going to regret because I feel like I need to do more work? And if the answer is yes, I need to rebalance.
So Jason, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate a lot this talk. So thank you so much for your time, Jason.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Bye. Take care. Bye. Yeah. Y hasta aquí la entrevista con Jason. Espero que os haya gustado, que hayáis aprendido algo nuevo. Si no te quieres perder la GS Nation, que se celebra del 9 al 11 de junio, tenéis un descuento en la descripción. Y si te ha gustado esta charla y este invitado, dale like, deja un comentario, que esto seguro que me ayuda para traer invitados tan interesantes como este. Nos vemos en el siguiente vídeo aquí en MeDoDev. ¡Chao!